As I've said many times, the name of this podcast, of course, is the Personalized Fitness Podcast, but the byline, the second line to that I love talking about is it's all about dispelling the myths of health, fitness, and wellness. I'm really excited about today's podcast because it's one I've talked about now. I'm well over 200 podcasts now. I've been doing this for a little more than 4 years. And finally, after doing some research recently, there's a myth that I've told you years ago that this was a lie. I told you that this was a complete myth. I've told you how much it's caused problems. But today I have the evidence of a 2020 study published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology that challenges, in fact, completely debunks the ridiculous concept that high saturated fat diets cause heart disease. We're talking about that today on the Personalized Fitness Podcast.
Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast
with Garrett Williamson.
Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
Good day and welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast. My name is Garrett Williamson. I'm president of Personal Edge Fitness. Thank you so much for joining me today on dispelling the myths of health, fitness, and wellness. And boy, are we finally debunking one of the worst. And when it comes to food, in my mind, the absolute worst. As Dr. George Mann said, the greatest nutritional scam pulled in the 20th century. We're going to dive headfirst into that today because finally, a reputable journal has published a study about this, and I cannot wait to get into it. If you have any questions about this podcast or any others, or if you have any questions dealing with dispelling the myths of health, fitness, and wellness, please reach out to us, area code 251-278-3343. That's 251-278-EDGE. You can also reach out to me at Garrett, Garrett, at personaledgefitness.com. Personaledgefitness.com, of course, is our website. You can contact us there. You can contact us on Facebook at Personal Edge Fitness. Hit us up on X at Team PE if you are so inclined. I think you can tell my excitement about this. This is one I've been talking about now. This is my fourth or fifth year, something like that, to do podcasts on well over the 200. And I've talked about this several times. I've said what a lie this is and called people liars on this show. And when I've given talks out in the public, and I did on my radio show, done on a podcast or whatever, I've talked about how this is an absolute myth and it's actually caused more damage than it's ever helped. And finally, an article came out talking about a study that proved what I've been saying all this time. Now, I was asked to give a talk recently. It was towards the beginning of the year. A company asked me to come speak, and I actually chose to speak on the live food. And the two things I speak mostly on are live food and live age. I'll speak on other general fitness topics, be more than glad to talk about that, answer any questions. Love talking about that. Love to do the public speaking for that matter. But those are the two topics that are in the highest demand. And whenever I do one of those talks, if it's been a while since I've given it, a month or two, then I always go back and I actually do some research. I go back and look and see if there's anything new that may have come out that strengthens my point or possibly proves me wrong. You know, I'll be glad to, if I was wrong, more than glad to point out where I was wrong, bad information I may have given. And in doing this research, I could not believe that I missed this because this is actually 4 years old now. Gosh, I can't believe I missed this. Maybe because I really never thought it was going to happen. But 2020, the Journal of American College of Cardiology. I looked this journal up. It's not a pamphlet. Been around for a long time. A study published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology challenges, it actually disproves it, but challenges the long-held belief that reducing saturated fat intake benefits heart health and reduces mortality. Yes, folks, right there, it challenges. And like I said, it disproves it. The long-held belief that reducing saturated fat intake benefits heart health and reduces mortality. Y'all know how monumental that is? Well, let me give you a little bit of a history lesson. It's one of my favorites. You've heard it before if you're a fan of the podcast. This absolute lie has been perpetuated for 70 years. But it all started, you've heard me tell this story, pardon me if you've heard it before. This all started in 1953 when a celebrity had a heart attack. A very popular celebrity at the time, around 80% approval rating as the President of the United States, named Dwight D. Eisenhower. Got to think back now, this is 1953. 1953, the World War II is still fresh in our minds. We didn't have the minds then that we do now that are affected by social media, and so you have that short-term memory. You forget things. Something happened, a disastrous thing happened 5 years ago or 2 weeks ago, and people don't remember it. 9/11 was, I don't know, some people believe it didn't happen, and it was just not that long ago. But in 1953, World War II was hot on our minds. And the former Supreme Allied Commander was still popular because he was the former Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the current president. He played golf a lot. Guys wanted to be him, and women so much revered him that they actually designed some of the clothing after his clothing. He had a short jacket that he was known for wearing called the Eisenhower jacket. And modern fashion, they started producing these Eisenhower jackets. Ladies were wearing epaulets on their dresses and stuff and clothing, and most of that was patterned after the military. Was patterned after Eisenhower. That's how popular he was. They thought he was in great shape because at that time they didn't know a lot of the ills that we know now, and so the fact that he was the president-in-chief and gave some fiery speeches and played golf every single day, boy, that guy's just the epitome of health. He had a heart attack. Scared the nation. And the reason I kept driving that home about the fact that World War II was still fresh in the mind, at that time, nobody knew anything about heart disease. And because World War II was fresh in our mind, we wanted to go find who's the guy, who's the person who knows about heart disease. And they weren't going to look for a German, obviously. They weren't going to look for anybody in the Asian territory. No, they were going to pick somebody that had to be an American, had to be what changed, I believe it was in the Potsdam Conference, where the power shifted from Britain being the world leader to America being the world leader. They were looking for an American. And they found that person in Angel Keys. And I've told you before, I beat him up a lot because of this. But Angel Keys did a lot of good, believe it or not. He was a biochemist, not a dietitian. He was a biochemist, and he actually developed the K ration, which fed our troops during World War II. It's fantastic. Should be remembered for that. I wish he was only remembered for that. That's why it's called the K ration. It's named for Angel Keys. But he also, at that time, in the World Health Organization, the WHO conference, he presented a paper, a hypothesis. And the hypothesis had 2 points. First and foremost, saturated fat diets cause high cholesterol. Believe it or not, that is actually true. Now, you may stop there. Well, Garrett, case closed. High cholesterol, that's it. And if it causes high cholesterol, that's all we needed to know. No, this is why you think that. This is why you think that is the case. Because number two of his hypothesis was that high cholesterol causes heart disease that has never, ever, ever been proven, even though it's been attempted numerous times. So many times, I don't even know how many times. Millions and millions and millions of dollars. Thousands of people have been involved in these studies. It has never been proven, which is why when you heard that first comment, saturated fat diets cause high cholesterol, you automatically assumed, oh, well, the case closed. It's because you've been told the lipid hypothesis 70 years later, and it's still called a hypothesis. If you don't know, my science friends out there, why it's still called a hypothesis, it means it's never been proven. That's true. I'd love for somebody to call me and tell me I'm wrong about that. I'd love to have that discussion because it's never been proven. That's why it's called a lipid hypothesis. That's why you believe that high cholesterol causes heart disease. It is a symptom. It is a symptom of heart disease. It has never, never been proven as a cause. And that's what this study came out and said. It actually came out and said that high saturated fat intake has no effect as far as damaging the heart health, or reducing mortality. This is amazing. I'm glad they finally came out with this. Why I say it's so damaging. Why I say this is so incredibly dangerous, and why I say it's caused more obesity than it's ever helped. This started the whole path to going and finding what food should we eat, what food should we not eat. It created the lie of bad food. Up until that point, if we thought about doing things wrong when it came to food, we didn't think about criminalizing the food itself. We thought about the fact that Johnny ate too much of something, which is what obesity is, by the way. It's an amount problem. It's not a type of food problem. It never has been a type of food problem. If you've ever believed that, I'm sorry. Somebody lied to you. If you are one of those idiots that's perpetuating that, please stop. Please stop. You're causing more damage than you will ever help. But it was amounts up until that point, up until we came up with this ridiculous falsehood, which is the lipid hypothesis. We actually somewhat concerned about amounts. Not until this biochemist comes out with this hypothesis. And the American government decides, okay, you're our guy. We want you to research this. And they give him an annual budget of $250,000, $250,000 a year. An annual budget. That's why I repeat it. Annual. You think about it, $250,000. Yeah, they gave him $250,000 to spend on it. No, they gave him $250,000 a year to research this. And he embarked on what is known as the 7-country study. I think there's still an institute in his hometown that celebrates this. It's just absurd. But the 7-country study, which supposedly he studied these 7 countries, he studied their diets, and they found out that the ones who had high saturated fat diets had high heart disease. That's it. I proved it. Perfect trajectory line on my graph. Case closed. High saturated fat causes high cholesterol, which causes heart disease. Case closed. That's it. Well, there are a few things that were kind of skewed a little bit. First and foremost, might be significant to know. Not really foremost, but first. He took a snapshot of what they were doing for 30 days. No matter what time, I didn't care what's going on during that 30 days. Just that 30 days, that's fair. We'll just pick 30 days. Well, I'll tell you this. If you pick 30 days in Mobile, Alabama, around February, end of January, February, catching the end of the national championship game where there's usually an SEC team involved, and you're catching Fat Tuesday, which is Mardi Gras, you're going to see a big difference in our diet practices during those 30 days. And one of those countries that he actually picked this certain area, which was a group of monks during Lent. Put 2 and 2 together. Don't you think their diet was a little different during that time? That was one of the good areas because he proved they don't eat any meat. Look at there. During Lent, they don't. During that 30 days. Well, that was one of the things. The other very, very, very significant and most important part of this is he actually studied 22 countries. Well, why is it the 7-country study, Garrett? Because he kicked out 15 of them. They didn't match his data. And he also produced 2 books that talked about the Mediterranean diet and Eat Well, Stay Well, the 2 books that he put out. One of them he put out before his research came out, and it was all about anti-saturated fat. And Eat Well, Stay Well, same situation. He put that out 30 days or so after the results were published. And so it was all based on a lie. So what did they do? Well, what did the general public do? Well, the general public said a couple things. First thing, what changes do we make? I can go on for days about this. Before I get into that, there were several professionals out there that were completely against him. Dr. George Mann is one of them. I've quoted him several times before. But there are several professionals that were completely against the lipid hypothesis. It's absurd. There's actually, I've said this on the podcast before, there's actually a Senate committee that were going to address this, and they're the ones that ended up writing the food guide pyramid, which really caused the problems. One of the scientists that were completely against what Angel Keys said actually is pleading with the then head of that committee, Senator George McGovern, pleading with them, please, sir, wait till the research comes out. If you don't, you could cause a problem that would have epidemic proportions, exactly what we have now. An epidemic of obesity. And what was he talking about? He was talking about several studies that were going on to try to replicate the now famous 7-country study. One of them, and I have to look at the timeline, but one of them may have been the MR Fit study, which was funded by our government, funded by the newly formed National Institute of Health. There were 12,000 people involved. $1.2 million was spent on it. It was the MR Fit study in 1970 was the one that actually we found the link of heart disease to smoking, which is true, which we know for a fact. Smoking it is a cause of heart disease. That study proved it. Other subsequent studies proved it. Some Britain studies they did. What they were trying to prove the lipid hypothesis. And once again, after multiple studies done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and I want to say there was one done in the 2020s, show that lipid hypothesis is not true. Never, ever, ever been proven, except for that one study, which we found incredible fallacies with. Well, as I've said before, this vaulted Angel Keys into the national spotlight. If he wasn't already there, he ended up on the cover of Time magazine. He ended up as the head of the National Institute of Health. And the sad thing was he ended up as the head of American Heart Association. I'll tell you why. First and foremost, I want to tell you I'm a fan of the American Heart Association. Please don't think that I'm bashing that great organization. But it's in the data. It's in the history. You go back and look at them. They were a fledgling national organization with an annual budget of somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000. It was ridiculous for a national organization. And then Procter & Gamble sponsored a radio contest called The Walking Man. You can go look this up. And I've forgotten, somehow you registered for it or whatever, and you're supposed to guess who the Walking Man was, and you won some prize or whatever. I don't remember all that. But they raised a lot of money because of this campaign, either selling their products or whatever. And they decided to give a portion of that away, which a lot of companies do. Personal Edge does, to Save Astray. Their group that they wanted to give it to was the American Heart Association. Great idea, fantastic. Well, what's that got to do with anything I'm talking about? Well, American Heart Association, the physicians and the scientists backing the American Heart Association said this lipid hypothesis is nonsense, and we don't believe it, we don't agree with it. Well, think about what Procter & Gamble sells. A lot of grain-fed products, a lot of cereals, stuff like this. And when people started not eating high saturated fat items, the first things that we were supposed to hate, first and foremost, red meat. I've said this before. You have probably thought, well, I don't know if I should have that red meat today. We probably had too much yesterday or whatever. All of that is based on a lie. And I'm sure that either you did it or you know people that have done it. watching that red meat intake. So bad for you. That's all from the lipid hypothesis, which is false. Another thing we're supposed to stop doing is eating eggs. Another one we're supposed to stop doing is dairy, butter, this kind of thing. Those sales of those items plummeted, and things like grains and whole wheats, all this stuff, skyrocketed. Procter & Gamble liked that. They have American Heart Association preaching against the lipid hypothesis, and they looked over at American Heart Association after they gave them millions of dollars and vaulted them into the national powerhouse organization they are today, which I am a fan of. Procter & Gamble leaned over to him and said, hey, you need to cut that out. So what did they do? They put Angel Keys on their board. And take a wild guess, what organization sponsored the majority of research going on out there? National Institute of Health, American Heart Association. They funded the research. There's a popular saying amongst PhDs in the education sector, and that is publish or perish. So they need their studies funded. If you did not agree with the lipid hypothesis, if you were trying to preach against it, you couldn't get funding. George Mann, the one I keep bringing up. There are others, too. This is just one I know off the top of my head. But Dr. George Mann was one of the people who came out against it. He was a Harvard professor and said this is not true. He could not get funded for 2 years. His funding was cut, actually. He couldn't get funding for 2 years, couldn't get hired for 2 years, and his tenure was revoked at Harvard. And by the way, as I've said this before, Dr. George Mann was not only a teacher at Harvard, he was also a graduate of Harvard, showing you they will eat their own. And so what happened? Well, to err is human, but to really foul things up requires the U.S. government. And this panel, the Senate committee, was supposed to get together to look into heart disease, and instead they did what any bureaucracy does, and they expanded their goals, their research, their responsibilities, and they decided to tell everybody how to eat. So they wrote the Food Guide Pyramid, which was written, Nick Morton, I may have that name wrong, but Morton, it's not really significant. I wish he was completely insignificant, is the one who wrote it, not a dietitian, not even a biochemist, not a physician, not even one of the politicians. Not that that would be any good. But who was Nick Modern? Nick was a journalist who was a vegetarian who happened to be friends with George McGovern. And that's who wrote. That is the person who wrote, no research, who wrote the Food Guide Pyramid, which really sent us way down the wrong way. And that's what led everybody to believe that, red meat was bad, eggs were bad, dairy's bad, and the good things are these whole grains, these different breads and stuff, pastas. In the 80s, pasta became a miracle. Light, L-I-T-E, the light option. Put pasta in this. Bagels became a miracle food. Linder's Bagels was nothing prior to all this, and all of a sudden just exploded on the national scene from being just a New York deli to this major mover and player in the nutritional world, because bagels were the healthy thing to do. Don't have that meat. That's whatever you do. And as usual, Americans thought, as most people do, hey, look, it's a little bit, it's good. A lot must be better. That's where our amounts got skewed, and this is what caused obesity to skyrocket, all based on this lie called the lipid hypothesis, and this lie that high saturated fat diets cause heart disease. And finally in 2020, we have a study in the Journal of American College of Cardiology that says, you know what? That was wrong. I'm waiting for them to come out with a study and say, hey, look, the lipid hypothesis is incorrect. Let's quit chasing that. And I'm waiting for all this to get out to the general public so that cereal boxes will stop saying heart-healthy food when they're not. That's all based on a lie. Excuse me for getting on my soapbox today, talking about one of my favorite subjects. I'm glad we finally have the proof. And maybe they heard my podcast, because years ago, before this study came out, I started the podcast. Maybe they heard my podcast. Say, hey, maybe we ought to look into that. But if you believe I'm wrong, if you want more information about this and dive headfirst into this or whatever, I have a bachelor's degree in exercise science. I have a master's degree in fitness management. I've been a personal trainer now for 33 years. I run the top personal training facility in the Southeast. Come from a medical family. My father is a physician. My brother's a physician. I am not a dietitian, nor do I play one on TV. All of the information that I'm giving right here, as far as nutrition is concerned, has been run by several dietitians. I've never had one disagree with me. But if you want to talk more about this, learn more about this subject, hey, give me a call at area code 251-278-3343. That's 251-278-EDGE. You can also reach me at Garrett, G-A-R-R-E-T-T, at personalizedfitness.com. Personalizedfitness.com, of course, is our website. Personalized Fitness is our Facebook page. Hit me up on Twitter or X at Team PE. Folks, quit believing the lies. There is no such thing as bad food. We need to quit believing that. We need to believe the truth if you really want to reach your level of wellness. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 888-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.